Carlos Nelson with Cascade Media Group. We got a real special guest today, and I used to worry her to death when she was on the Black Archives board. And I know she's probably like, Miss Nelson, I'm just one person on the board. And, you know, she has been involved in Black studies and been involved in our community forever. Who do we have here? Yeah.
Dr. Delia Gillis, Professor of History and Director for the Center of Africana Studies at the University of Central Missouri.
All right. Hey, audience, I couldn't get all of that out. That's why I go, who do we have here? But Della, tell our audience a little bit about yourself. As I like to say, you know the deal. Let's go back to kindergarten and talk about how you was raised. Let the people know who you are.
Sure. Well, for those in Kansas City, you know, because it was my home for some time. I'm originally born in the great state of Virginia. I'm a 10th generation Virginian, can trace my ancestry back to a 1619 ancestry, even though it is one of my European ancestors, and all the way back to the 1400s to the English Channel Islands. I've also been able to trace my ancestry on my mother's maternal line. I am Timni of Sierra Leone. The Timni people are located in the northwest corner of the great country of Sierra Leone. So I grew up in the heart of a slave community, what was once a slave community in our great nation. And so that's where my roots run very deeply in the state of Virginia, even though I've lived, like I said, all my adult life in the Midwest.
Yeah, I went to Virginia State in Petersburg as a freshman, coming out of New York, and home of Scubanard wine.
Yeah, Virginia State is one of my family's alma maters, as well as St. Paul's College, which unfortunately folded a few years back. But my great-grandfather, who lived to be 106 years old, sent all of his children to that school, except for my grandmother, who was a beautician by trade, but it has been a family school. I'm also descended from a family of teachers. My mother was a reading teacher, and all three of my maternal aunts were educators. I just lost my father's oldest sister, who retired from the DC and Maryland public schools. And so I come from a family of educators. Another piece that, you know, kind of ties that together. For the longest time growing up in the country, I grew up in the country in rural Virginia, where tobacco fields. There was a dilapidated school building that sat at the edge of the property, and that was actually a Rosenwald school. So my family helped my great-grandparents, my paternal great-grandparents, ceded a portion of their land at the front of their property, and the Love School was a historic Rosenwald school, and you can actually find pictures of that. I found photos of it in the archives at Fisk University, because they have some images of the Rosenwald schools. So again, I come from a long history of history. And I think one of the questions you wanted me to answer was like, how did I become? And I think it was just embedded in that spirit. It wasn't that I had a family that sat down and taught me history lessons. It's just who we were. I spent a lot of time at the skirt of my grandmother, who unfortunately I lost when I was age 7. But that was a real special relationship for me. And so we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of her death this year. And I plan to write about that, because basically there's a before my grandmother passed and an after grandmother passed. They're two totally different worlds, but one rich in history and rich in education.
Tell our audience what schools you went to, from grade school on up to college. Give them the 411.
I went to Virginia public schools. When I went to first grade, If it was not the first year, it was one of the very first years that the Virginia Public Schools integrated, because we were one of those communities that chose not to honor Brown v. Board. And actually my late uncle, who passed the other year, was actually the first person to help integrate his high school. So when I went to school, it's what we call, oh gosh, what's the word we use for it? Tracking. So even though African Americans and whites are in school together, we're not necessarily in the classrooms. So one of the things that really has marked my experience was always being one of the first Blacks, or the only Black, or one or two Blacks always in the upper level academic classes. We had three groups. You had the upper group, the middle group, where most of my African American peers were, and then kind of the lower group. And what is really interesting about those of us that have graduated from those schools is really the middle group has been the group that has done the most astonishing things as adults. But as a young person, I was very much observing this situation of, I didn't take for granted that I was smart or intelligent or hardworking. I just knew I wasn't the only one. And so I never, my identity never came from the fact that I was in the upper group. I didn't feel like I'm so special and there's something wrong with other people. I recognize that there's something wrong with the system here, because I've got friends that should be in these classes as well. And some of you that are in these classes with me, I'm not sure if it wasn't for the color of your skin that you would be there. So those were just early observations, but I graduated from high school at age 16. I skipped a grade. And a lot of students chose not to do it because what it meant as a senior is that you had to take history and government together. And that wasn't an issue to me. That was a piece of cake. So I went to summer school, took my 11th grade English, and I graduated a year early at age 16. I think the seeds of becoming a professor were probably always there. When I went to junior high school, I actually petitioned not to take home ec. I wanted to take world history and world geography. So I'm that's the 9th grade. I'm in the 9th grade.
What high school was that?
Bluestone High School. Bluestone High School.
Bluestone
High School in Skipworth, Virginia. There was a tobacco field, high school tobacco field. We rode down a long country road to get to school.
You ever work in the tobacco field?
No, my great grandfather had tobacco fields. We wanted to do it one summer. My mom said, absolutely not. We would not work in the tobacco barns. We're like, Mom, we want to make some money. And she's like, absolutely not.
What you say in the barns? Because I asked that because my childhood, I'm from New York, and they made me go down to South Carolina to my grandmother's in the summertime, and they did tobacco. And I'm saying I was a little boy, and they have you driving the mules and the drags down the tobacco field as they're putting the tobacco in, and then you take it back to the barn and they're lacing it up. And you, by the time I was in high school, no more driving the bag. You get in the barn and get up on, and you hang that tobacco. And I didn't know whether you had any of that experience, but obviously you've seen it.
I've seen it, but no, but we were not allowed because, as I said, my grandfather, the one that sent, my great grandfather who sent his children to St. Paul's predominantly, had a lot of acreage. He was born in the late 1800s, so he had a lot of acreage, and they had tobacco. And then the tobacco warehouse, the one that we were trying to convince our mother that we should do some summer work, was actually in one of the towns. And she said, absolutely not. So, but kind of circling back to that high school experience, I didn't want to take home ec. As I said, I had cooked with my grandmother and baked with my grandmother. And I'm like, I don't want to take home ec, because the guys would take home ec, the guys would take shop and the girls would take home ec. And I'm like, I don't want to take home ec. I want to take world geography. I will take that with world history. I petitioned to the counselor. Funny enough, my guidance counselor was actually the guidance counselor that my parents had. And I've submitted my petition, and they said, no, the courses were too similar and that I could not opt out. In actuality, what I remember most about the courses is that the world history courses were for the kids that were already being tracked to go to college, and the world geography was not. But I was not allowed to do it. So clearly, I've always had a love for history and the social sciences, and tried to pursue it as much as I could as a young person. But when I went off to college, I originally was studying mass communications and eventually earned my business degree. So I have an undergraduate degree in business because I was also of that generation where, you know, you need to go out and make money. This idea of being an artist or historian or professor, things that did not equate to being able to provide for yourself or your family were certainly not encouraged.
In high school, did you excel in academics in any way? Like they have the valedictorian and all of that type
Oh,
stuff.
oh no, I did. I was an
Talk
honor
about it.
student. I was in gifted and talented. I participated in FBLA, Future Business Leaders of America. I was on student council. I was a majorette. I was a cheerleader. I ran track. I actually ran hurdles in high school.
That's what I went to
Not some-
Virginia State for, on a track scholarship.
Yeah. So I actually went to Virginia Commonwealth University on scholarship. I did 1 year at Virginia Commonwealth, but then I ran off and eloped and spent time in Germany. So I ended up graduating from the University of Maryland from their Germany campus. And I was also reflecting today on the sense of how academia has changed. When I made that particular move, it was kind of frowned upon. I had a cousin who let it be known that she finished college in 4 years. It took me 5.5 years to finish that undergraduate degree. But I was traveling throughout Europe, and that has had a lot to do with, you know, some of the things that I do now. That travel started very early for me. So I graduated from the University of Maryland, and before I became a professor, I had a really long history in international banking. So I've worked in credit union savings and loans, and ultimately worked with American Express in Germany, and was a personal banker, foreign money teller, being able to conduct transactions in 20 or 30 different currencies outside of US currency in the German Deutschmark, customer service and loan servicing. So that's how I started out.
So
And the way that,
I'm the cutoff king. I want to ask you, with the current crisis going on in Russia, and you've had some experience in Germany, and you really hit it on the banking, and with these sanctions, and just as I was coming back to the office to do this interview, they were talking about the SWIFT, how the banking system is devaluating, or the devaluating and all of that. So you have a real understanding of what's going on when you're talking Federal Reserve and the international banking system.
Yeah. Well, for me, at this point, it's really about the human rights violations. So yes, the rubble has dropped tremendously, and rightfully so. We have human rights violations going on, and I've just posted some videos today that, again, people that are Black and brown are being mistreated in horrible ways. We've seen a lot of footage of people of color being denied access to evacuation,
right? You know,
and bodies being
the cutoff king again. The cutoff king. Okay. When I seen that last night, let me say this: Cascade has a lot of networks, and because of the humanitarian, I've been in business since '08. I have never changed my profiles on my companies. They'll have Cascade Media or my picture or something. And I put their flag up on all my sites. And I've been in business since '08, right? Because of I understand really what's going on. But when I seen what they were doing to Black people of color, waiting 2 and 3 days and weren't in the queue, was in the queue to, I wanted to take all of that off, but the spirit said, that's more important than that. That other problem can be dealt with. And it's hard for me because I think I'm Black Power Ungawa, really. And yeah, sometimes I'm Malcolm, reincarnated in my way, because I'm not backing down from the system. And it's hard to understand that all white people are not bad. Nobody is all bad, but you know, sometimes as a Black man, when you see these injustices, you might want to hang that on a whole population. And when I seen that, I'm serious, Gillis. That last night, that turned me. I was like, but the spirit said, no, you doing the right thing. And supporting that movement. You're in the media. That's a world issue.
Yeah, it's a world issue. But what is clear is that the same issues, because of structural white supremacy, you see it acted out the same way. So even in this crisis, you see people of color, whether they're from the African continent or the diaspora, being treated the same way. I mean, people actually physically being removed so someone else can take their place, to be evacuated. So hopefully, all parties and souls will be safe. But it is an outrage for the African diaspora community, without a doubt.
Talk about your how you got over there at CMSU.
Okay, so I did my master's degree at UCM, and that's when I transitioned. I had been in banking for a while, and was doing training. So I think that's when the teacher book really hit me. And I was pursuing a master's, and at the time, the master's in business was not recognized. It was not accredited. And so I looked at getting a teaching degree of the master's in history. And so actually the master's in history. So actually I was ABD. I had completed my comprehensive exams, and I had two offers. I did have an offer to return to the University of Central Missouri, where my mentor, Dr. Art McClure, really wanted me to return. But I also had an opportunity to come teach at UMKC. And the offer at UMKC was most attractive to me because I would have the opportunity to travel to South Africa, which I did. I taught for 2 years. I earned my PhD. I was promoted, and then I had an opportunity to spend the semester in South Africa at the University of Western Cape. My PhD was in African American history, but Africa, South Africa in particular, was my outside field. So that was what enticed me to go to UMKC. I was a part of a cohort of 5 African American faculty members to be hired to build their program. But within the 7 years that I was there, there was such a high rate of attrition that I was the senior ranking African American faculty member at UMKC, and I was in my early 30s. I was teaching people that was older than myself. Actually, one of my former students, it's her 70th birthday today. So I was teaching a lot of older adults who were coming back, particularly for the liberal arts traditional program. And I helped build the Black Studies program with Dr. Noli Ray Rooks, who is at Cornell or Brown. She went to Princeton. She's done very well for herself writing, started writing about the politics of hair, but writes on a variety of topics. And so the Black Studies program at UMKC lasted for 25 years. They've just ended their program. I was also part of the team to help launch the Black Culture House, which is right there on the corner of Rock Hill Road. But I think they've changed the direction of that space as well. So after 7 years at UCM, at UMKC, I decided to return to UCM, where I've spent the remainder of my career. And with the retirement of our French faculty member this semester, I will be the senior ranking African-American professor on campus, meaning I've been there the longest at the rank of professor. We've only had 4 people. I was the 3rd person.
So you have tenure?
Yes, I'm a full professor and I'm tenured. Part of the 3%. That's only 3%, even after you earn that PhD and get a university position. Only 3% of us hold that position. And with what's happening in higher education, that's definitely going to become smaller and smaller because institutions are moving away from tenuring faculty in terms just maintaining.
That's why I put that in, because I had seen it was really hard to get tenure right about now, and it was really hard for Black people to get tenure.
Right. And a lot of people don't understand it. They think that it's easy, but if you think about most jobs, you might have a 30-day probation or 90-day probation. Technically, as a faculty member, until you earn tenure, you're on probation. So we're on probation for like 5 or 7 years. We earn that ish. I'm gonna be really honest because people really don't understand what that means. You can be fired. Generally, at some point, you get a contract for a year, but you don't have a guarantee. So it's a really, really long probation. It is really intellectual and academic hazing in some ways for those people who are not familiar with the ins and outs of higher education.
I want to switch gears. How do you see African American? I don't even like calling myself, now that I'm halfway woke, at least I think I'm woke, I don't even like calling myself African American because that really puts a distance. We're Africans, basically, as far as I'm concerned, or I use the term Black. And how do you see our community relating to the mother country? Do you think that we have been so westernized, so indoctrinated through the educational system and in our day-to-day life? Because I'm in media, when I have these conversations, I have like 2-hour conversations with supposed to be movers and shakers that do they really even understand? When you even think that you're thinking Black, do you take into consideration that ever since the 7th century that Europeans have controlled all forms of communications on this planet, and what you have been indoctrinated with per se skews your thinking? I use this all the time. When you start painting God on the Sistine Chapel white as a European, and from an educational point of view, you're looking at 221 and 222. You're not looking at the early 7th and 6th century when nobody could read or write hardly except for the clergy and a few people. And I don't think, see, you're in history, so you know better than me. I haven't done no studies, but right until about the 16th, 17th century, people were beginning to learn some things. And then with the Bible and all of this, how do you see that has shaped Black people here in America or in the diaspora?
Well, that's a really loaded question. And I just want to go back with your original proposition of the terminology. For me, I choose to use the terminology of African American as opposed to Black. Even though I use them interchangeably, I like using African American because it keeps that connection. We are African. We're African culturally, and we have those connections. Africa was born in the slave ship. So one of the disconnects that we have is the fact that we are a blended people of many different ethnic groups primarily out of West Africa, but not totally. I mentioned my Sierra Leonean ancestry, but I also have Kenyan ancestry as well, so that's East Africa. But I refuse to let go of our citizenship as Americans and the fact that we helped to build this country. I'm a 10th generation American. My family has been on that red Virginia soil for 10 generations. And I never used to describe myself that way until the first election of President Barack Obama. And one of the things that infuriated me most about the criticisms, he was not perfect, let's be clear, but the criticisms of him were very racialized, and the ones around his birthright were particularly, they were the ones that bothered me the most, that questioned his citizenship, which made me in turn think, but wait a minute, how can you be questioning his citizenship, or even my citizenship for that matter? My family's been here since the very beginning. And I don't think we always take ownership of that. Some very astute writers will make note of the fact that most African Americans in this country have been here longer than many of the other
the Europeans, period. Let me say this to you. Well, I'm glad I guess I know I'm not by myself, because I'm struggling with the African American Black or diaspora, how I want to describe myself, because I'm always saying, I raise that flag. You might think I'm a damn Republican, because I know my damn family died building this country. And this country, from my perspective, is more owned by Black people. Every instance in fighting for this country from the 1776 or whatever, the first ones die as Black people. And then we wind up building the whole country on our backs. And when I have these conversations with the majority community, and they be trying to get slick with me with their conversation, how I end it all. I'm like, if you a human being, you African. I don't care what race you think you are, what religion you think you are. If you human, you came out of Africa. And you need to understand that. And you need to go in the history books and look why your color and what you're doing, how that evolved. But sure as my name is Carlos Nelson, you come out that continent. And when I was talking earlier about painting God in a certain image and what have you, most of us, they have dumbed down, not just Black people, that they have been dumbed down in us, but the whole society, with the invention of the internet and all of this, where you can really go get information. The information we going to get, what's Kendrick Lamar doing? What's these other people are doing, instead of looking at how we can come together and make a difference.
Well, that is true. This generation has way more access, but information versus knowledge versus wisdom are different things. And we also have to look at different experiences. I think we have to look at how, what types of relationships and partnerships make sense moving forward. To go back to one of your past comments, we are people of African descent in the US, have been, as a cultural group, our country's moral compass. And so when you think about the ways in which we have certain creeds that we don't follow, that we say that who we are and what we are, we haven't always lived up to that as a nation. And again, that's why they call us this great experiment of what we'll do with that. So certainly I think, hundreds of years later, when they look back on African Americans, they would say that, and we say some of that now. The other piece of it in terms of, but again, it's how you choose to process the information. For me as a historian, as a scholar, as a public intellectual, I look at the ways in which African descended people have been dispersed all over the world, and what we represent as that particular cultural group. It comes specifically out of that. So it goes back to what you're saying. So then, yes, we do have a connection, and we also have a disconnect on the African continent, because we see ourselves as African. It was the great historian Sterling Stuckey who talked about that the African identity was born in the dark and horrid conditions of those slave ships. That's when we become African. Prior to that, we did not see ourselves as African. You were your particular ethnic group, you were your particular kingdom. You did not see yourself as African. So we still struggle with that a bit today because of, or more than a bit, because of the partitions in Africa, the nation states that we have in Africa where ethnic groups are split, the fact that we have colonial influence, to be kind. And
I was
a
getting
lot
ready
of
to
the
say, oh
African,
boy, you cut me up. You was being very kind when
to be
you
kind,
say influence, when they cut
influence.
Africa up and no blacks was at the table, and
There's
as
a partition, but even now that colonialism has been technically overthrown, when you look at, for example, the French colonies and the ways in which um, France really lives off of its African colonies, or the fact that the rest of the world, one of the things that I say in jest, but I mean it very much, when they talk about, oh, Africa is so poor, I'm like, no, give Africa back her stuff and Africa will be fine. All of the resources, the mineral wealth, the gold, everything, uranium, all of the natural resources from what we need to make our cell phones work,
yeah,
come out of the continent.
and they give, well, hey, what they give us, they give you some filthy loans with some paper money where they're taking hard assets. Even this war in the Ukraine is deeper than what it seems. They have all these natural resources that you can't get nowhere else on the planet.
Yeah.
And as like I told you, I'm just waking up over the last, really since you met me, and this has been a slow, but the more I've been digging in, I'm waking up like, and looking at mitigating circumstances, looking at the what I call the big picture, and it all boils back down to white supremacy. And that, but from my perspective, it all boils down also to media, because like I said, Europeans have controlled all forms of communications and media since the 7th century. And you might know even longer than that. And when I say that, I'm saying what was being given to the public. And when you look at the Bible, the King James, and the this, the that, and me personally, if I can't prove it with empirical scientific data, I'm not even looking at it. Because when I learned about the Middle East, and that's a new phrase, Africa is Africa. And then when, because I'm a history nut, and ever 20 years ago, or maybe longer, when the History Channel first came on, and PBS and all of that, if you're looking at that stuff, it's revealing a whole lot of different things. I remember the curator of the Cairo Museum, I forgot what his name is, he was pushing back on that Egypt didn't, and the color of their skin and all of this. And I'm like, no. The more it got into academics and Ptolemy, their line, and then thinking back that what did they do when they conquered? They killed all the males, took them away. You look over 30 generations, shoot, right here now, when you get Black men in these majority communities joining up, skin color, everything changed. And over that period of time, the complexions and everything has changed over millennia. And if you're not digging deep, you only see in the surface. And you know, one thing I like about the Black history people, quite a few of them, they say no matter where you go on this planet, the deeper you dig, what you're gonna see is our face. When you start looking at history from the Americas to anywhere on this planet, you'd be like, damn, what the darkies doing over here? How did they get, how they did with America, Columbus, all this whitewashing? As a historian, how do you feel about that?
Well, it's a social construction. It's a social construction. One of the things that was so very evident to me when I was in South Africa was it depended on whose living room that I was sitting in, how I was perceived. Sometimes I was American, sometimes I was colored, sometimes I was Black. It depended on who's, because of the social constructions in their society, what they said you were. And so that's what we live with, that we live with a social construction of whiteness, and everything else is based on that. In reference to you're making mention of Egypt, we failed to realize that we have more pyramids in the Sudan than in Egypt. And I love the sounds of Blackness, We Are the Drum. I always use that song in my class because there's a line in it that says, the Nile moving up the right way. The Nile runs toward Egypt and not the other way. And so indicating the ways in which we know knowledge and whatnot is passed. And so you have to be a student of the history. You have to be a student of the economics. And I would agree that religion and the media are certainly tools that have been used in our modern era for capitalism, because that's a part of our modern society. So let's be clear, all societies have been at war. We are all descendants of slaves, whether it was Roman slavery or Greek slavery. I'm actually a descendant of 3 slave trades. I'm not only a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, but my family, I'm a descendant of the trans-Saharan slave trade, the Islamic slave trade, as well as the Red Sea trade. That's why I have Southwest Asian and Kenyan ancestry, because of the Red Sea slave trade.
Do you think
so? Slavery.
Yeah, I'm the cutoff king.
So what I'm saying
you
is
mentioned Arabs. You mentioned Arabs. That's why I'm
yes.
the cutoff king. Do you think that we understand that Arabs, they were worse on Blacks than some of the majority, and as it relates to slavery?
Well, yes.
I might be wrong. You the history. That's the history I know.
well, surely some of those conditions were worse. And it is those routes that existed, a part of the trade routes that helped to better enable the European slave trade, particularly in West Africa. But it was also a transfer of knowledge, not only of goods and of people and of education. And so I don't like to compare apples to oranges, just as if you look at Roman slavery was much more harsh than Greek slavery. The Romans would say in Greece, you couldn't tell who a slave was because it was different. But what we understand about the transatlantic slave trade and the enslaved people that helped to build our country was that we were chattel. And that property, and that you were born into it, and that your situation would never change. And this is what makes our experience distinctive, along with the fact that we were part of a nation that was supposed to be practicing democratic ideals. Some societies didn't play with that. It's like you're a slave and that's it, and that's what it's going to be. But the way, for me, you talk about awakenings. For me, some of my awakenings have really come with Christianity, visiting the slave forts. I happened to be at Cape Coast Castle in 2019 when Steve Harvey actually visited, and he talked a lot about his time there. But one of the things that really just was a gut punch, again, I've been teaching it for decades, but the chapel was over the men's dungeon. So they're conducting Bible study and worship, but you have people in chains, in their feces, in their urine, packed together in a suffocating room, but you're learning the gospel. So there's a big disconnect with that. And I think a lot of people have always kind of intuitively understood that, but to actually be there and experience it. And I would also say that I do believe that some of my ancestors came to Cape Castle. I've been to 3 of the castles in Ghana, because they're called castles, but they're slave forts. They're called castles. And I go to Elmina. I don't have a problem. I've been to Christianburg. That's where the Danish. I don't have a problem. But whenever I go to Cape Coast, I've been to Cape Coast 4 or 5 times now. I always get a suffocating feeling when I'm there, whether I'm in the dungeons. Sometimes I can't even go in all of them. Get a real suffocating feeling, because it's a dark, dank space where people are crowded into each other. When we think about colorisms in our community, I always remind our darker brothers and sisters that those of us that look a particular way, we are descendants of rape.
I always say that too. When I started having, I'd be like, y'all raped my great-great-great-grandmother before the boat even stopped rocking. And I'm like, what Africans do you see that are all hairy like me? All these are European genes that are manifesting themselves. And going back to Virginia, remember I said South Carolina? So a little bit about my people. So my grandmother's father was a white man. He was an Irishman, but he gave all his sons 100 acres, white or black. And we still got 50 acres of that right now. I guess he had some type of conscience or something. I don't know. But I know all my white relatives live right up the road from where the farm we was on, and they owned the little store in the area where you got your groceries on credit per se, and you worked, that whole thing. A lot of the younger kids, 40, and they don't know that experience of and this is what really hurts me, Gillis, is I'm switching gears again. Our leadership, our politicians, I'm talking about on local and different levels, where they have bought into this capitalism and are not doing right by the community, besides lip service. And the giants, when, it sounds passe, whose shoulders we stood on, especially in the civil rights movement. If one person wasn't taking the bus, we all not taking the bus. And if we all are moving forward in a block type situation, and whether it's a block vote or block boycott, and now the mindset, I hear some people. I had a brother tell me last year, hey, I'm the only one out here where he moved. And I was like, you proud of that? That you think you hang your hat on that? And all of that type stuff has started to bother me since I have woken up.
Well, I want to address 2 things. One is a bit of romanticizing our collective ability to come together. And 2, the fact that I think the general public, our leaders included, sometimes have a very difficult time connecting the history and legacy to present. So I'll start with, you mentioned the Montgomery bus boycott. Yeah, we boycotted and we came together. But one of the side jokes was that the pastors in Montgomery let Martin Luther King take the lead. He was only 26 at the time, because they said, well, if it doesn't go well, he's young, they can move, they can start over. Or even when you think about the Little Rock Nine, everyone in the community did not support the Little Rock Nine. There were people who felt like the students shouldn't do it because other people may have been penalized. Some people may have lost their job. What we saw in the civil rights movement was a strong enough collective effort to push forward the agenda, along with the media, because TV really made a big difference to the civil rights movement and allies. So those. Carlos, did I lose you?
Yeah, no, I'm here, but your picture's gone.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we're back. And so those particular aspects made the civil rights movement successful. We're not a monolithic people. We've been separated. The enslaved experience brings us together, but then the ways in which slavery was operated, with a division between house and field, you have those separations. And then you also have those separations which are very purposeful in terms of the mulatto class, of the mixed race. And so you have all those elements historically that prevent us from being cohesive.
Coming together.
It just is, because those are things. Because I remember I made a comment to a student about a particular election. I won't say which one. And I said, well, he might have us all out there picking cotton. And my student said to me, they said, well, maybe this time, Dr. Gillis, you'll be out in the field with us and not in the big house.
Boy, that showed you exactly what you just explained.
Exactly.
Yeah, you ran that down. That hit, bam.
I'm like, so that's how you see me. I don't see myself that way, but that's when you see me. So colorism is still very, and that hair issue is still a big issue with my college students. We do a lot of talks and panels whenever they want to put something together. That is a major topic that they deal with.
Did you ever see the interview with Sidney Poitier? I think after he won the Oscar and what have you, and they was asking him all these stupid questions, and he was like, "I'm a human being," and he was so eloquent. There are other things that you could be talking to me about in this space and time, and this is what you bring? My color? So I get what you're saying. So in wrapping this up, Dr. Gillis, how would you?
Well, before what I want to say, and so when you talk about the leaders, what I think is problematic, and which I had the honor of being able to teach for the 100th anniversary of commemorating or memorializing the Tulsa Race Massacre, was being able to teach my students in lifetime. And for them to be able to study historically the race massacre in 1920, but then I'm sorry, 21, but then also to see the permanent effects. We were in class, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, my students couldn't come down to Tulsa. So we were doing a lot of things online. And so we were in class when they took up the Black Lives Matter out of the historic district. And within weeks of that is when they had found some of the bodies in the unmarked grave. And so that was a powerful teaching moment for me to try and teach predominantly white students what Black Lives Matter mean to African Americans. Here we have a grave site that we've known about through oral history. It was through a survivor's recollections as a young child to say, well, this is the location. And then you get the anthropologists and the archaeologists and other forensic folks in there to use the science to find something that pretty much in the community people knew. And so it's moments like that where we make a lot of headway. For me as a historian, it's easy for me. I think that way. I research that way. I understand the connections of something that happened in the 1930s that may impact my community right now. But I don't think the average educated person makes those same connections. And I think that's why leaders will make those decisions out of political consequence at that moment, as opposed to understanding how we got to a certain point.
So we're wrapping this up. What would you have to say to our community in closing?
I love my community, and I think we have to love on ourselves. It is February 28th, and when you asked me to come, I said I want to come this day because it's not the last day of celebrating Black history. We celebrate that every day. But I never want people to forget the work that Carter G. Woodson put in and the African American community in picking this month. There are still educated people that believe that the man gave people the shortest month. And it was not. It was born out of the African American community first as a week to honor Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And then it grew into a month under the leadership of Dr. Edgar Toppin from Virginia State University. And so I think
between the eyes there, girl.
we need to read. We just need to read. We need to think. We just need to have a questioning mind. And I think we still just need to be the beautiful culture that we are, flaws and all, but really look globally. That I believe that we have an opportunity globally, not just in the US, to push forward our humanity.
Hey, Dr. Gillis, I'm stealing Jim Watts's line now. Jim always closes. I steal his line, make him mad. This is his line on closing. It was a plum pleasing pleasure having you on the show.
Well,
all right, with all his niceties. Now I'll use my closing and I tell him, you better not steal this. When you invest in your community, you're really just investing in yourself. Good night.
The program is brought to you by the Kansas City Business Association.